Hello, everyone. It's Michael Shermer, and it's time for another episode of The Michael Shermer Show. This one is brought to you by FATHOM, FATHOM, which you can read about and log into at fathom.fm, or you can go to the App Store and download Fathom Podcast Player. What is Fathom? Okay, this is super cool. I'm sure you've heard about all the recent developments in AI, like ChatGPT. I found out what it might be used for on the first day of class at my semester Skepticism 101 class at Chapman University, when one of the students asked if they can use ChatGPT to write the essays for them. No. But anyway, you know what it's all about, where you just type in a search, and instead of getting a bunch of pages that uses AI to actually write out a thoughtful answer. For example, somebody just sent me this where they typed in, "Write me an edgy rap about Michael Shermer debunking conspiracy theories." It just popped this out. "Listen up, it's time to get real. Shermer's in the building. Time to feel the heat of skepticism. No room for doubt. He's got the facts. He's shouting it out." Anyway, this goes on and on. I won't bore you with that. But that's the kind of thing that this new AI can do. Well, these developments have been put to good use by our new partner and friend of the show, Fathom. It's a totally free podcast player. I just downloaded it myself. It's super cool. And you can use it on your iPhone, your iPad, your Android, and so forth. And it's like your AI-powered personal assistant for podcasts. Fathom automatically generates chapters and timestamps for every episode. You know, you all know I consume a lot of audio content. The downside of that with podcasts and books and lectures and so on is you can't find stuff when you want to look it up. It's like, oh yeah, I remember I was driving along the 405 and I remember talking about this. Where is that? I have no idea, right? Now you can put Fathom to use to do that. It just generates, again, chapters and timestamps for every episode. And at a glance, you can see what topics were covered in the episodes that you're listening to. It even suggests a few highlights so you can get a good feel whether you're interested in a particular episode or not. Fathom also, and this will be great for those of you who've been writing me and asking for full transcripts of the podcast, which we haven't been able to do. You can do it with YouTube, but the transcriptions are horrible. Well, Fathom fully transcribes the show accurately. So you can read along while you're listening or just search the podcasts as if each episode had its own bespoke search engine. That is super cool. The search understands natural questions. Like, let's say you typed in, "What is the replication crisis?" Several of my guests have talked about this. Well, now you can just type it in and see what pops up. When I have one of these experts on there, you can just see what it is that they said. So it's kind of like a Google search for podcasts, and it works for podcasts you follow, but also for some you've never heard of. It gives you type in the ones you want to use this for, but then it also suggests other podcasts that I've already discovered, some that I didn't even know about, that are related to the kinds of things I'm interested in. Thanks a lot. Now I have even more content to consume. No, I love that. So check it out. It's something totally new with the new AI. Chapters, timestamps, full transcripts, highlights, all there automatically for you. Go to Fathom, FATHOM.FM in your browser, or just go to the App Store and type in Fathom Podcast Player. It's really great. Check it out. All right. Thanks for listening. Here's the episode. My guest today is Jim Davies. He's a full professor at the Institute of Cognitive Science at Carleton University and the School of Computer Science there. He's the director of the Science of Imagination Laboratory, and he co-hosts, along with Dr. Kim Hellemans, the podcast Minding the Brain. He's the author of Riveted, The Science of Why Jokes Make Us Laugh, Movies Make Us Cry, and Religion Makes Us Feel One with the Universe. I love that book. I think I had you on with this one, Imagination, The Science of Your Mind's Greatest Power. And here's the new book, Being the Person Your Dog Thinks You Are, The Science of a Better You. I don't know what my dog thinks I am. He thinks I am the person that walks him every day and feeds him, and I don't know if he has many grand expectations of me or not.
Yeah.
So, clever title. Nice to see you again, Jim. I love the book. It was super interesting. Yeah, so two massive big parts, you and sort of self and others, I guess you might say.
Mm-hmm.
So let's talk about, well, actually, first, before we get into that, just give us, for people that are logging in for the show for the first time or haven't met you before on other shows, who are you and what's your background? How'd you get interested in all these topics?
So I'm a cognitive scientist. My main area of study is imagination. And right now I'm working on my next book, which is on consciousness. And
You've solved it.
No. The thesis of that book is that we don't know what we're talking about, basically. There's too much disagreement. But I'm a book writing scientist, and I also run a lab and have grad students and that kind of thing. This book came about because I had some ideas for books, and I talked to my agent, and he said, "I'm not crazy about any of those. Maybe you should. I think you should be thinking bigger at this point." And I thought, what can I do that's big? So I was interested in productivity, and I was getting into effective altruism stuff. So I thought, why don't I write a book about the science of being a better person, just how to be more happy, productive, and moral. And so that's how I got started on the book. And I really enjoyed the research and writing it. And that's who I am.
It's an important topic. I mean, I've had quite a few books along these lines come across my desk. It seems to be I guess in the larger category, the positive psychology movement since the 90s. The history of psychology before that was mostly focused on bad stuff that happens and bad things that people do.
Right.
And there's this other side of our nature that's good. And of course, this is what people want, right? They want to know what can I do to lead a better life? So since you're a scientist, and in science, we want to operationally define things so we can measure them properly. Because if you don't even know what you're measuring, then what are we even talking about, right? So how do you begin defining what it is that you want to study and that people want in their lives?
So I just assume that people want to be happy. I think some people might dispute that in certain contexts, but I think in general, people want to be happy people and happier people. So about, maybe a quarter of the book is about the science of happiness. Luckily, it's not super complicated, and we can summarize that. But because I'm writing mainly for a Western audience who's obsessed with productivity and achievement, and so am I, and often that is something they perceive as a instrumental goal toward happiness. I decided to tackle productivity as well. So the first part, which is about you, is about mainly happiness and productivity and what science says about how to maximize those things. And then the other part is about being a good person. So self-help, I think, is often too focused on just feeling good and not, being a really a positive force in the world, So I wanted to talk about for people who are interested and wanted to be the best people they could be. It's not just about you, it's about your effect on this world that we live in. So what does science have to say about how to be as good as you can?
You mean even in a selfish, egocentric way, you're arguing I would be happier and a more fulfilled, purposeful person if I didn't just focus on myself.
I think that there's some evidence for that. I don't think it's necessarily universally true. And I think that there are certain ways that you can help the world that are better for the world, but if you were to do less effective ways, you would feel happier. So I do think sometimes there's a bit of a trade-off there. I tell a story about how I had these shoes and they were starting to get a little bit old and I was thinking of replacing them, and I walked by a bus stop and there was this guy there with no shoes. And, he was waiting for the bus and his feet were about my size. And I said, hey, do you want my shoes? And I gave him my shoes and walked home barefoot. And I tell people that story and they're like, oh, Jim, that was so great of you, and I tell them I donated, $1,000 to the Humane League and they barely bat an eyelash. Right. So,
Right.
I feel it. I feel like this,
Yeah.
the personal connection can make you really happy. And the ways that to make the world better aren't always the most heartwarming.
Yeah, we have a next to my office here in Santa Barbara, there's a McDonald's. So occasionally there's homeless people out there, and as I walk by, they ask me for money, hey, spare a couple bucks for a cup of coffee. And I just go get them the coffee, or I buy the two sausage egg McMuffins for $5, and I give them one of them. And it feels like, because you never know if the guy's going to take a couple bucks and go to the liquor store, which is on the other side, right? So I kind of feel like, well, if I just give him the coffee and the food, that seems better than the money. But I guess why is that? Because I want to know it's going to what I think it should be going to.
Yeah, you're kind of assuming, and this may be sometimes true, but you may be assuming that you know what to do with that money better than they do. And I
Mm,
think in some cases that might be right. In some cases it might not. Um, maybe they have to pay off a debt, but that doesn't get them as much money when they're panhandling. So they're telling a little fib or something like that. So, but there's one of the most effective charities out there, Give Directly, basically relies on poor people being able to make the best decisions about their money and not this very paternalistic. So what you're doing at a small scale, governments and aid organizations have been doing at a very large scale for a long time, sometimes to disastrous effects, when we think we know better than the people we're helping what they need. So I think it's just something to reflect on. It's sometimes, it might be better and sometimes not, but it's something to not just assume that don't always assume you know what they need better than you.
yeah, okay, that's a good point. But back to where we began. I mean, I feel better doing that, and when you got praised, that gave you a little hit of dopamine or something, right? And so, wouldn't that be a kind of self help, or you're doing it in a selfish way? Well, you do feel better, but that's a good thing. I don't mean a selfish way. I mean, it's true morality. You actually feel like you want to do it, and you feel good doing it. You and I are not theists, so we don't think we're going to get rewarded in the next life for it. But isn't it better to do it because it's the right thing to do and you feel good doing it, as opposed to some external reward?
When you're talking about doing good for the world, I don't really care what it does to you, aside from how it affects your compliance in the future, right? So if you get pleasure out of something, you'll do it more in the future, which is great. But like the joy you get, like if you save somebody's life, the little joy you get out of it is so negligible compared to somebody's life being saved that I don't really think it's a huge factor. I mean, I also don't see other people's lives as fundamentally more important than mine either, right? So I'm willing to take a little hit to my happiness to make the world a better place, But where there's a win-win, obviously that's the best deal,
Mm,
and it's easiest to
well,
convince people to do it.
yeah. Let me come at it a slightly different way. So, in a debate I was doing with Dinesh D'Souza about morality and God and science and so on, he's a theist, so he argues that ultimately, you atheists only have utilitarianism, and you're only doing it for some calculated reason. Whatever your arguments are about the greater good for the greater number or whatever, you're not doing it out of any kind of genuine moral sense. It's just some kind of calculus you're making, much like Peter Singer's argument about walking into the pond to save somebody, but you're ruining your $500 boots. Why not give $500 to this charity and have the same effect? That to someone like Dinesh, like a believing theist, that sounds like a kind of cold, calculating move, not a deeply moral action. And so what I'm after
Yeah,
here
I
is,
completely agree
but
with him. I think that people should be calculating about it. It's because ultimately I'm not interested in being moral because it reflects my moral goodness. I'm interested in being moral because it makes the world better. And if I do it for selfish reasons, or I do it for calculating reasons, or I do it for warm glow, or I don't, that doesn't matter to me. What matters is, am I saving lives? Because and what I worry, so I actually wouldn't even argue with him about that. I mean, I think there is some strong moral conviction, but I've had to redirect my moral activity away from my passion, because if I just went for this moral feeling that he's talking about, I would be doing stuff like giving my shoes away to people next to me, not helping people who are most in need, who I don't get to interact with. As a person in a rich country, none of the people around me are very good deals in terms of helping. So yeah, I think he's right. I don't think it makes me a worse person because because I am utilitarianism. It doesn't matter what's going on in my head. It matters what effect I'm having.
Right, but I guess I'm after the true nature of morality, that we do have a moral sense of right and wrong in our nature that we inherit from our species, that it's not just culture, it's not just slavery's bad because my culture says it's bad, otherwise I think it's good. That there's something deeper in there that we're tapping, and that's a kind of true morality. The utilitarian effects aside from that, there's a deeper thing going on there. This is what I want to argue. Maybe I'm wrong. So I wrote about this thing I called the Indugu effect. This was Jack Nicholson's film about Schmidt, right?
About Schmidt, yeah.
So he's this retired insurance guy, whatever he was, and he's bored out of his skull and trying to find something meaningful to do. And he's channel surfing one night. And he runs into one of these little charity aid commercials. You adopt this little child here. It's $30 a month, and it's going to provide water and vitamins and soccer for his little team and so on and so on. And he's like, oh, okay. And Indugu is the name of this little African boy. And so the narrative arc, I'm just repeating for our listeners that don't know the film, is he's writing these letters to this little Indugu who turns out can't even read. And yeah, but it works because that he cares about Indugu. There's a little picture of Indugu. And I did this with a Romanian girl, and they sent me pictures of her family, the little house she lives in. She was playing soccer. Here she is with her soccer friends and so on. And it made me feel like, yeah, I actually care about that person right there. And so I don't know how you think about this in a utilitarian sense, but the charities know this is better than just showing me a picture of 10,000 starving kids in Rwanda or something, because I don't care. It's hard to care.
Mm-hmm. I'm glad you brought this up. I've never been asked about this in an interview, and I'm thrilled to talk about it because I do agree with you that there is we have I think, morality that is more or less genetic. I also think that there is a cross-cultural morality that either it is genetic or it so reliably arises in cultures on Earth that it's universal for another reason. But that is kind of this baseline morality that is full of all these weird quirks and inconsistencies and things. And what reflective people do, and ethicists, moral philosophers do, is they try to look at all of our moral intuitions, we can just group them together as, and try to make some kind of principles based on it. And the major ethical theories that have arisen in the world tend to cluster around the big three: utilitarianism, deontology, and virtue ethics. And we don't need to go into what they all are, but basically they're all, I think I look at them as ways of systematizing and making sense of a kind of a hodgepodge of moral intuitions. And we get a clearer sense of what the good is. And once we have this theory, then we can start to see how it will sometimes even violate our moral intuitions. And sometimes doing the right thing feels wrong. And sometimes doing the wrong thing feels right. And if you just rely on your intuitions, then you're going to just, you're not going to find those things. And that's why the principles are important. So to me, like the theories like utilitarianism or whatever you have are ultimately grounded and justified in moral intuitions, but in a way that systematizes and makes sense, and it comes up with an external theory that you can kind of crank through and generate moral judgments and decisions that are a little bit more principled than just relying on your gut feelings that you're born with.
Right. So in the past, contrary to my argument I just made, most people thought slavery was just fine as long as it didn't happen to them. And same thing with genocide. I mean, the phenomenon of Holocaust denial is interesting because no one felt the need to bother to deny it in centuries past. As long as it didn't happen to them, they were perfectly fine with genocide, right? So their intuitions were wrong, but are they really wrong? I mean, why is slavery wrong? How would you make that argument?
So the there are a couple of ways to say that slavery is wrong, and I'll just, as a utilitarian, I'll just give the utilitarian answer is that utilitarians basically view the moral landscape involving welfare, and humans are just containers of welfare, and so are pigs and chickens, and if chickens are conscious, and so what you want to do is you want to maximize welfare. You want to have as much welfare as you can, and so a human is merely morally just a container for welfare, but it doesn't really matter which human has the welfare. And so when you're looking at slavery, it is the utilitarian argument against slavery is that the reduction in welfare for the slave is way bigger than the increase in welfare for the slave owner. And the thought experiment that convinced me of this was somebody said, okay, if slavery were really a win-win, or were like a morally good thing, people should be willing to be a slave for 10 years so that they could have a slave for the next 10 years. And no one would enter that agreement, because we all know that being a slave would be so risky and so awful that having a slave for 10 years wouldn't merely make it worth it. And so, that this says that, in general, slavery is a loss of welfare in a society. So that would be the justification from utilitarianism of why slavery is wrong.
Here's my deontology argument, and I'm just quoting Lincoln. As I would not be a slave, I would not want to be a slave owner. It's just the principle of interchangeable perspectives. You don't have to do any calculation. Would I want to do this, to have this done to me? No, so I should not do it.
Yes. I mean, I don't know if you want to argue about these things, but,
Sure. Why not?
Well, deontology makes the most sense when we're talking about other humans. And deontology really gets into problems when you start talking about morality more generally about non-human life forms, infants and fetuses and people in vegetative states and possible sentient artificial intelligences or aliens. Like the golden rule doesn't apply. I mean, it's problematic to insist that the golden rule applies to mosquitoes, for example. And so deontology needs to have, because all of their examples involve, almost always involve humans treating humans in other ways, it kind of gives it a deceptive simplicity. But when you start looking at whether it's okay for a person shipwrecked on an island to eat a fish to stay alive for another day, deontology kind of struggles. And so utilitarianism doesn't. Like, calculations are intractable, but just theoretically, philosophically, there is a way out, even if we don't have the numbers we need to calculate it.
But from a utilitarian perspective, it seems like the argument could be made the society as a whole is better with slavery than without. Because look at the total sum of benefits most people get from having this small group of free labor, as it were. And in fact, this is kind of the argument that the current modern reparations activists make, is that you white people benefited from slavery for all those centuries. Even though there was a minority of us, the majority benefited from it in a very calculable way. And they actually want to make a utilitarian calculus and say, this is the amount that's owed everyone who is a descendant because of the long-term consequences of slavery that have affected economic outcomes and wealth disparity and those sorts of things.
Yeah, so the way I look at that is that they are looking at the benefits that slave owners and their descendants and cultural descendants got from slavery. And that benefit is sizable. But that doesn't mean that society as a whole is better because of slavery, because the slaves were a part of the society too. And the utilitarian, the way you're thinking about it is basically correct. But what you would do is you would look at the gain in utility and the gain in welfare over time based on having slavery, say in the United States. But you have to subtract all the harm done to the slaves and their descendants and that's what society is like now. So if you had two possible ways history could have gone, America with and without slavery, say, and we were able to calculate the overall welfare of the world into the future, then we would be able to say, yeah, slavery was either a good or a bad idea. My suspicion is that for the reasons I've explicated, I think it would come out worse in a world with slavery. But even what you're talking about with the reparations, they're saying, yeah, you benefited, so we need reparation. The point is that they also feel their people's incredible loss, which has to be factored into the calculation of whether the society is better off or not.
Yeah, but in that sense, usually slavery is treated as so morally evil that it doesn't matter what the calculus is. It's wrong. You could have all the numbers and say this, overall for 1,000 years of slavery is in some utilitarian way better for humanity going forward. It doesn't matter. It's still wrong.
Well, that's why slavery is not a particularly interesting issue morally, because current people, most people, no matter what their philosophical inclinations are, agree that slavery is wrong. They just have different ways of justifying it, right? So, the differences between this is what's interesting. One of the things I kind of discovered, at least for myself while writing this book, is that because this moral underpinning that we've inherited through evolution, this set of moral intuitions, all of the moral theories are basically trying to explain them. They are the data kind of to be explained in a way. That's why they actually agree on most things. They just have different ways of justifying the same conclusions. And then we get hung up on things like trolley problems and stuff, because those moral dilemmas actually are the few instances where the theories bifurcate on the decision, right? But slavery is one of these things where modern people, we all now think that slavery is a terrible thing. But if you were to go back to slave times, whether this person or that person would get convinced. Some people might be more convinced by deontological, and others by a utilitarian argument, right?
Well, the Quakers, the abolitionists, activists, they made mostly a deontological argument, using religious themes, things like that. It's just wrong to do this.
Yeah, and I think most people are deontology. They are okay. So for those of you not educated in philosophy, let's deontology is kind of like a rule-based, a rule-based ethics. Like there's don't kill, don't steal, be good to your neighbor, blah blah blah, and it's sort of a all or nothing, good and bad. It's bad to kill, it's good not to kill, or something like that. Where the utilitarian perspective is more of a balance of good and bad done, which strikes some people as a little callous in certain cases. So when Michael's talking about deontology here, he's talking about kind of a simple set of rules that for which you don't actually look at the magnitude of the good and the harm. You simply follow the rules, and that's what being moral is all about.
You want to throw in virtue ethics and just round it out there?
Yeah, sure. So virtue ethics is a theory that what a person, to be good, a person should be trying to cultivate certain virtues. And when they make a moral decision, they're supposed to reflect on those virtues. And the virtues are typically things like bravery and compassion and that kind of thing. The big issue for me with virtue ethics is that when you really ask, is something of these two choices, which one is a better choice morally? The virtue ethicist's answer is something like, go ask a virtuous person. And that virtuous person would reflect and come up with something. But it's not, to me, it's not, I guess, crunchy and mechanical enough to actually come up with definitive answers without just sort of asking somebody's opinion. In a way that deontology and utilitarianism, you can come up with very definite answers for right and wrong, or how good or how bad, without a whole lot of interpretation, ideally.
Just reflecting on the bigger picture here, do we have three systems and have for centuries because that's what it takes to cover most test cases, and no one of those can cover the same number of test cases? And so it's not going to be like in physics where we just have the Big Bang theory and there are no other theories, or the theory of evolution, and that's pretty much covers almost everything. You have a few minor wrinkles with sexual selection in addition to natural selection, but there's not two other big theories that are also there to explain things. Is it that human morality and ethics, or just the dilemmas that we face, are just messy enough you need at least three, and then each of those can be broken down into subsets and so on?
Yeah, I've thought about this, and I don't really know the answer for sure. Um, Ethics textbooks talk about these being the three big ones, and of course, each of them breaks up into a whole lot of sub theories. And the little I've seen of, but this is a very Western categorization, a very Western view. But when I look at, for example, in China, Confucianism is very deontological, and there was a Chinese philosopher, I forget who it was, whose philosophy was very utilitarian. And in fact, a lot of Buddhist ethics has a lot of utilitarian ring to it. Um, and maybe if Aristotle never existed, we wouldn't have had virtue ethics. It would have been just those two. From the from the stuff I've seen from other cultures, but I haven't seen a whole lot of um, sophisticated ethical philosophy. Not that it doesn't exist; it might. I'm not an ethicist by training, but what I have seen does seem to sort of fall into these one of these categories. Usually though, deontology. I mean, I think most cultural ethical systems out there are some version of deontology because it's simple and I think it's our kind of natural way to describe our intuitions.
Yeah. Well, Joe Hendricks makes the point in his book, The Weirdest People on Earth, or whatever the title is, something like that, that all this is based on Western culture. If you lived in a highly collectivist society, then it wouldn't be the good of the individual. We wouldn't be talking about individual rights as being so important. It would be your calculus would be based on the group more than the individual.
Yeah, and I think that could, I think that you'll find utilitarians who are more interested in individual rights and freedoms, and utilitarians who are more interested in overall welfare. But I think you're fairly libertarian, aren't you yourself? So I think people who have a libertarian bent just kind of have a conviction that by protecting rights and freedoms, that is an important or necessary stepping stone to an overall increase in welfare. I think that they would say the world will be a better place if we give people freedoms and rights and that kind of thing. Where I think people who are interested in the betterment of the world that aren't as libertarian might move more toward, well, like in the meantime, people are starving, so let's redistribute the wealth, even if it means taking money away from people who are rich. So it's kind of like they both have similar goal in mind. Like we're striving for the best world we can make it. What are the intermediate steps that are important to get there? I feel like that's sort of the area of disagreement. So what I'm saying is that whether you're a deontologist or utilitarian or virtue ethicist, even, you could still be a libertarian or the opposite. Because it's just that then it becomes a matter of what are the mechanics and what are the chess moves we need to make in society to lead to this better world that we all want. And people have different ideas about that.
Right. But let's say we had an Islamic society that thinks it's better for society as a whole if women do not have the same rights as men, if women are not allowed to drive and work and have to wear the burqa and so on. That's better. That's our society. Mind your own business, you Westerners. And your focus on individual freedoms for women is misplaced. That's a kind of utilitarian calculus for the whole society. Or at least the men.
Well, that's it, right? Like at least the men, right? So to me, it doesn't really count as a great utilitarian example if it involves the women suffering, right? I think that, I actually haven't seen studies on this, but I think it would be actually interesting to see what kind of buy-in the women of these societies have for these rules. It might be higher than Westerners predict, But if you are oppressing one group of people for the betterment of another, then it seems on the surface of it a very non-utilitarian way of looking at the world.
Well, some of the women do go along with it, but they're of course raised in that culture. They don't know any different. It's
this is the tough thing. It's like let cultures have their own ideas of what's right and wrong, and there's some point where we want to say, okay, that's too much though. Like I think my example I like to bring up is foot binding in China.
Yeah. So, right.
When the communists took over, like say what you want about the communists, they did a couple of good things. And one of them was like, all right, no more foot binding. The women are getting jobs. Like it was a very egalitarian movement, an equity-based movement in that sense. And there was enormous resistance to a lot of parents thought that their daughters wouldn't be able to get married if they didn't have bound feet, and the government just said it is just over. And I think that the China is better, and the world is better because they did that. So there you have a moral. I think it shades into moral, but certainly a cultural system. But like where we draw the line about that, and where we say it's so bad that we're going to like. Where do we stop with cultural relativism? Like different cultures have their way of doing things, and like leave them alone. And where is it's just too far, and somebody needs to step in and fix it. I think that's a very. I don't think there's a simple answer to when you should do that, and it's a very interesting problem. I've never heard a general solution to it.
Well, one is the ask first principle, as I call it. It's just ask the person who would be affected. Now, of course, maybe the women in these societies again are brainwashed. They know they not only don't have choice, they don't even know what the options are. Right? You have to have options, not just choice. You have to have options. Viable options. This is the argument about just we can use some other examples here as test cases of prostitution. So my libertarian inclinations are to decriminalize it. Just let consenting adults do whatever they want to do in the privacy of their bedrooms. None of my business. Right? But the argument is that, well, but it harms society as a whole. It kind of brings down the neighborhood. It kind of lowers standards of decency. And no matter how tightly regulated it is, you think you're going to make it, like in some countries, like in Germany, there's still just massive abuse of women, girls, teenagers, and so on. And that at some point the government just needs to step in and just criminalize the whole thing, or criminalize the buyers and not the sellers, and so on, because there's so much corruption. Something like that is an argument that's made.
Yes, and I think that arguments like that are appealing to utilitarian proclivities. I think there are some people who just think it's wrong, even if welfare goes down. Like they're just, and this is from Jonathan Haidt's stuff that I found very interesting. With that there's this sanctity moral principle that is kind of immune to, like it doesn't matter if there's no like when people like left wing people or liberal minded people will say, well, there's no victim in this situation. Some people are like, well, that's not the point. It's like it's demeaning and degrading. Even if their life is better and they have more money, even if more people are happy, it's still wrong, because it just sort of violates what the universe is supposed to be like. It's not something I could particularly relate to, but I feel like I understand the position a little bit better, thinking of it that way. And so I think that if, to the extent that that's true, sometimes people who disagree on the issue are talking past one another. But if they are engaging in like, no, the world will be worse if it's legal, it like in terms of harm and utilitarian, then they're like sort of playing on the utilitarian playing field, and then it becomes a matter of, okay, well, let's look at the evidence. Let's see if this is actually how it happens. Let's look what happens when it's, is the abuse worse when it's legal or illegal, and and then we can go from there. But if everyone's agreeing at least on a utilitarian approach to it, then I feel like that's a win for society, because then it just becomes down to arguing about the numbers and the data.
Even that, I think a conservative would make something like a utilitarian argument with the broken windows theory of crime. So you have broken windows, you have graffiti. It brings down the whole norms and values of the neighborhood. It signals to people no one gives a crap about this neighborhood. Go ahead and break into cars and so on. And turnstile jumping in New York City subways and so on. And that you just need to clean it up on the small scale, and then it ratchets up from there. So if you have, pornography houses, pre-internet, or prostitutes walking the street or whatever, it brings the whole thing down. And so it isn't just two consenting adults just mind your own business. It brings down the neighborhood or the society. In a way, conservatives tend to make more deontological arguments based on their religious principles, but in a way, it's still a utilitarian calculus.
It is. And they might be right. To me, like, I wouldn't want to. My proclivity too is, my intuition is that prostitution should be legal, but I am open-minded to the idea that if the data actually supports that idea, then maybe it should be illegal. Like to me, it's a data-driven question. It should be, right? So, I don't know a priori that they're incorrect about that. I'm not a sociologist or an economist or something. I think that that's a very interesting idea and it should be investigated.
It might be just to drill down on this a little bit more, having to do with human nature. Alan Fiske's idea of the four human relational models of communal sharing, where we just exchange things, hierarchical, teacher, student, parent, child, employer, employee. And this is why, for example, having sex between a boss and the employer, employee, teacher, student, or parent and child is so wrong, because it's violating these kind of relations that are built into us. And so violations of this, like if I go to a restaurant and offer, instead of paying for my meal, invite the chef over to my house for dinner, they would not accept that. Or you go to a friend's house for dinner and you take out your wallet and give them some money, this would just be so weird.
Yeah.
Or my favorite example, Woody Allen's little joke about his watch. He goes, my grandfather on his deathbed sold me his watch. Right? It's like, what? And
yeah.
And I think sex might be in that category. It's not something you sell. It's not a market economy product or service. It's something you do out of love and caring, or just enjoyment or whatever. But you don't sell it. Much like organ sales.
Yes.
My friend Sally Sattel promotes organ sales. She has this whole model of how it could be done without abuse and the rich people owning the poor people and so on. But still, most people's intuitions are like, that just seems wrong to sell a body part like that. And maybe sex is like that.
Yeah. So I those are great examples. And I think in both cases, I think it's an potentially answerable question, right? So does the existence of prostitution in a society make sex worse for everybody? Like, does the value of sexual relationships and then the value
I don't
that
think
sex
so.
Well, you don't think so, but it's not a matter of opinion. It's a matter of science. Like, you could measure this, you could figure it out, and it might be a very hard study to do. But if without data, you're just posturing your intuitions about it, which
a pro prostitution activists make that argument that there are some subset of men who cannot get sex otherwise, and they have to pay for it. And this is good, because then they're happy or whatever. They're not out causing trouble because they're or raping women or whatever. And that's a good thing. Or they're incels or whatever it is. But so I mostly agree with you on this. But I just had a prostitution activist on my show, Rachel Moran. Her book is Paid For: My Life in Prostitution. She was a prostitute for 7 years in Dublin, Ireland. And she is adamant about it is abusive always in every case. And I don't care what outlier examples you give, the woman who's putting herself through law school by, charging $3,000 a night as a high-end sex worker. She doesn't even like the term sex worker. It makes it seem like regular labor. And it's not regular labor, I think, because of these reasons. And, to pull back from the extreme versions of that, like Louise Perry has a book out called The Case Against the Sexual Revolution. And there's two other books along these same lines of kind of women in their 30s who were told by feminists in their 20s, you can have all the sex you want just like a man, and it won't have any effect at all. Men can do this. Why can't women do it? And their answer is because women are different than men. and asking, the effects of sex on a man versus a woman are two different questions. And so that's a different kind of calculation.
Yeah. I think it's a very interesting issue. I like to try to boil it down to data.
Yeah, but it's hard. Yeah, but how would you collect that data? That's a hard one.
Well, I could speculate, right? Like you can look at societies that do and don't have prostitution, or you can look at societies before and after prostitution was legalized, and see if attitudes towards sex change in a way that is measurable and probably and meaningful. So maybe people don't enjoy it as much, or they don't associate it with love as much, or it's not as part of a something else. And you could look at at any changes that are made. At the same time, you would also look at, like what these say, people who are, for whatever reason, aren't able to engage in normal sexual relations with people, and prostitution is the only route that they have. You'd have to look at the benefit that they got, and the benefit that the prostitutes got, and the abuse that the prostitutes got, and then it would just be an informed decision, and how do we want society to, how do we want it to work? And I would apply the same logic to organ donation.
Mm-hmm. Well, that is, so Sally and other activists in this space, they do make this argument that it's a utilitarian argument. Really, just treat it like anything else, any other product or service, and let the market decide, and regulate the market so that it's not abused and so on, which is what the pro-prostitution people argue. Just regulate it. Okay, as to the answer to your question is I kind of looked into some of it. It's pretty messy. You have scholars on both sides going, the country's much better. No, the country's much worse. Germany it's mostly legal. The Nordic model is you decriminalize the sellers but criminalize the buyers. So they go after the Johns, and they try to get rid of the pimps because that's where a lot of the criminality is and so on. But it depends on, it's like gun control. It depends on who you're talking to and which data set they're using, right?
Well, this raises an issue that I try to emphasize in the book too, is that if really smart people and really well-informed people are in fundamental disagreement, don't waste your time. Like, there are so many obvious evils in this world and obvious goods in this world, that to throw your life behind a debate where there are people smarter than you and better informed than you on both sides, the probability of you being wrong is, maybe close to 50%. And, if you just respect the fields, and also, to me, I think it's a decent heuristic that if you can make reasonable, non-brain dead arguments and empirical arguments for and against something, it probably doesn't make that much difference. So why don't you put your efforts towards something that is so obviously good that there's no debate about it, or very little debate about it, and you'll probably be doing more good there than in a controversial place where, if you are doing good, it's probably very little good, and you might be doing bad.
Here I'm thinking, though, a utilitarian calculation would be something like addressing an empirical truth that we want to get the answer to. But what if it's not an empirical truth? What if it's a political truth? Example, what's the right percentage of immigration that we should allow each year? Or how many people? 100,000 a year? 1 million a year? 10 million a year? What's the right number? And I think there is no right number. I think it depends on the goals of the society. What is it you want to accomplish? And if you want this, you should have this many people. If you want that, and that, what's the policy of the country? That's just decided politically. We'll just have an election. This team gets in and they change the laws, and the other team gets in and they repeal the laws, and it just goes back and forth, and we're never going to get there.
Yeah, so I think that's actually kind of true for all moral questions, because people disagree on what it means to be good. And so if I'm debating with somebody about the moral goodness of something and they're not utilitarian, then that debate needs to happen first, because we're not going to agree on what the eventual good is. To me, like what the perfect rate of immigration is a definite number if you assume utilitarianism. But of course, you might not.
What's the
number? Might not. Oh, I don't know what it is. I'm just saying there is a number. But I think your point was that it's unanswerable. My point is that it might be practically unanswerable, but theoretically there is some number. If you were to look at the overall welfare of the entire universe to the end of time, with with different levels of immigration, there would be some number that would maximize the welfare, and that would be what it is. But if you if somebody has moral values that do not involve welfare, maybe, like some people I've talked to value diversity over welfare. So even if people are overall happy without diversity, there is some intrinsic benefit to a diverse having different cultures in different places or something like that, that it needs to be weighed against the utility. And if they're right, then it becomes much more complicated, because then you have to have a weighting mechanism with, say, diversity or whatever you're trying to optimize there. You've got more than one number you're optimizing, which means there needs to be a weighting. And deciding what the weighting is another moral decision. But I think that for any very well defined notion of what good is, you could find some number of optimal immigration.
Yeah, okay, I see that. So, but the conservative might argue, I don't care what the economic consequences are of opening the borders or tightening them up. I want people who speak English. I want people that are Judeo-Christian. I want people that are, faith and flag and family, Western values, whatever the list you want to make. Western traditional values, something like that. And that's our goal.
Yeah, I think a lot of conservatives are okay with the idea that it's that welfare given to their in-group is better than welfare given to other people, and so that's a fundamental disagreement. Like I don't think that they would say that it's better for Mexicans that Mexicans are banned at the border. I don't think they. Right, I don't even think even they would argue that. They just don't care about the Mexicans.
Right. Right. Well, but here again, even their seemingly deontological arguments are really utilitarian. It's better for our society in the long run, for everybody here, if we hold these values.
Yeah. What are you asking about that?
Well, I guess I'm just kind of riffing here off what you said.
Yeah. So they might believe that, and it might even be true. But to me, it's as utilitarian, it's beside the point, right? I mean, if you just think America for Americans and screw everybody else, you're going to have a different outlook on the world than I do.
But it's a utilitarian argument. It's better for our tribe. So your argument requires no tribes.
No. I think that it's an abuse of the term utilitarianism if you make it tribal.
Yeah.
I mean, I think it's pretty fundamental that a unit of welfare is equally valuable no matter who or what contains it.
Yeah, I would agree with that.
If you're saying that an American util is more important than a Mexican util, you're not utilitarian.
Yeah, you're not doing it right. Okay. Fair enough. Yeah. I tend to be fairly libertarian about that as well. Just open the borders and let people, let the economy determine it. I'm in California, Southern California here. We have lots of Mexicans. Why do they come here? Not to abuse the welfare system and so on. They come here to work. And, the conservative argument, well, they're stealing our jobs. No one wants those jobs. Those jobs are backbreaking, and they don't pay that well, but for poor Mexicans, they pay pretty well. And, that's why they're here. If the opportunities weren't here, they wouldn't come. Right. So just kind of let the market determine. The problem is we have other concerns that, all nations have.
Yeah.
And so all nations have some restricted immigration policies.
Isn't that interesting?
Yeah.
Really all of them do?
Every country.
Even the shitholest countries in the world won't take unlimited immigration?
Yeah, I'm afraid it's so. Well, I guess Australia is really tight, right? And Japan is pretty much tighter than ours.
Yeah, but what about like Congo? I mean, do they have
I don't know. Well, they might on paper, but they're not enforced, right? Okay, what about abortion? Now, how do you think about this, since it's a topical issue? The right to life of the fetus versus the right of the woman to choose. What takes precedence?
Oh, shy away from the tough ones.
Oh, come on.
Abortion's a very interesting. It's a very interesting topic because I've never, if you look at it from a biological perspective and you look at the human life cycle and you look at sperms and eggs and you look at conception and fetal development and all the way up into birth and through maturity and the formation of the prefrontal cortex in your early 20s and then into senescence as you get older, it's really not a scientific question about when in that continuous line of activity somebody becomes a person deserving of rights. And so even people who are in favor of legalized abortion almost never have a principled exact moment where it becomes murder. Or if they do, it's not philosophically justifiable. I mean, even birth is in a sense arbitrary. It's morally arbitrary. Like we draw a line because we kind of have to, but where that line should actually be drawn is, as far as I know, very unclear, even among experts who are in favor of it. But to the same extent, the conception is also, in some sense, an arbitrary location. So I see the abortion debate much more along the line of there's a period of development that the human species goes through in the course of its reproductive cycle, and the people who disagree about abortion are disagreeing about where the line is drawn about when it becomes morally unacceptable. That is not answering your question, but as somebody who is utilitarian, I would use a utilitarian approach to it. And one of the reasons my next book is about consciousness is that in writing this book, being the person your dog thinks you are, I came to realize / acknowledge, discover that consciousness is the most important thing in the world. It's the most, and figuring out what beings are conscious and which ones are not. And for humans, when a fetus becomes conscious and what they're capable of suffering or whatever, whether AIs can be conscious or how we would know, is the most important scientific and moral question that the world faces. And the world is valueless without consciousness. Like, it would just be a universe with no moral value at all, no value of any kind. It would just be just things happening. And so I, that's why I wanted to tackle it in my next book. But the relevance to the abortion debate is that, okay, when does this growing thing actually feel pain? That's an important question. How much pain does it feel? How much is it actually suffering? How much suffering is involved with the people around it? And I'm not just talking about abortion. I'm talking about murder. I'm talking about any kind of ending of a life. The moral value of ending a life depends on, and this includes killing a fish or killing a chicken to eat. The moral decision to end a life should be based on the overall effects for the rest of the universe in terms of the welfare that's taken away and gained, right? So I don't really, my inclinations are, I'm pro legalized abortion, but I don't have a really firm philosophical or utilitarian argument for why. So I suspect that it is something that intelligent people will debate forever. I honestly do. I don't think it's something that's going to be solved.
Soluble problem.
I think it's a really interesting problem.
I think that you might be right, although in general, culture has moved more and more toward granting adult women rights. And you can't have everything, so we have conflicting rights often. And somebody has to get the right, somebody else doesn't. I've been thinking about this with the trans phenomenon of late, where male to female trans want to go into women's bathrooms, locker rooms, playing women's sports and so on, and women are not happy about this. And I want to support trans rights. Trans are humans. If they're in the United States, they should be protected by the Constitution. They should have the same rights as everybody else. Can't discriminate against them and so on. But if you have a conflict like that, women want their own spaces. Okay, I got it. I want to support that. And trans want to go in those spaces. Hang on now. You can't have both, right? Somebody's going to feel violated, and something has to go. And to me, the hard-won rights that women have gained over the last century, those should be honored, and that's just the way it goes. Can't have everything. Same thing, I'm not a big fan of abortion, just as a concept, unwanted pregnancies. It'd be, like most of my pro-choice friends, legal, the phrase, rare, legal, and safe.
Mm-hmm.
right? Let's reduce the number of abortions that we can, unwanted pregnancies. But if something happens, then, the rights of the woman triumph over the rights of the fetus in at least the first trimester, kind of our fuzzy set intuition there. Like when does a teenager become an adult so that you can drive or drink or go to war or whatever? What's the day? Well, there's no, but the law has to draw the line somewhere because we got to enforce the law. Regardless of what you scientists say about a spectrum and fuzzy sets or whatever, it has to be right there. So, but I think our intuition's like, well, some first trimester seems okay. Third trimester, no, that seems wrong. Somewhere in the fuzzy middle of the second trimester is 20 weeks, 22 weeks, 24 weeks, something, that could get moved around based on neuroscience and the stuff you're going to write about in your next book about when the consciousness comes online, what week does it come online, and so on. How would you even measure that? But I think our intuitions are kind of moving in that direction.
Yeah, and law, and I, we're talking. I think we've got to be careful mixing up morality and law. Law is has to be a blunter instrument than morality because it has to be understandable and communicable, and so you get these what I think are a little bit silly laws, like if you're speeding a certain number of miles an hour over the speed limit, then it's one crime, and if it's less, then it's a different crime. But it doesn't matter what the speed limit is. But to me, like going 50 in a 10-mile-an-hour zone is way worse than going 40 miles an hour over the speed limit on a highway, right? But what are you going to do? Put a differential equation in the law? Like,
right?
It's
right.
it's blunt because people need to be able to understand it. The cops need to understand it. The civilians need to understand it, and so it could be that more like morally. There can be like in a sense, a bespoke decision in every case. But when we're trying to make a law to make society good over the long haul, it's going to necessarily have to make dividing lines that might seem arbitrary.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, certainly that happens. Well, I mean, so much of life is these kind of compromises you have to make that ultimately may not be soluble on some scientific level. That's the problem we have here, and I think you're going to face that with the consciousness. What are you a vegan? Do you eat meat? And where do you draw the line on that? Talking about animal rights.
Yeah, good question. So I deal a lot with animal welfare and animal consciousness and morality in the book, and I am not vegan. What I do is I tried to be vegetarian and I couldn't get myself to do it. And
really?
Yeah, I couldn't get myself to do it. I really eating meat is such a big part of my energy levels and happiness and productivity that I just I couldn't do it. And so what I did change was, so first of all, I'm not convinced that eating beef is bad for the world. So I'll just say that, like, beef, I think is possibly not even problematic at all. That's given climate change, given animal welfare, given everything.
Wow.
I've done the calculations. Wow. I think it might be okay. Pork is not great. Chicken is probably really bad. So, according to the calculations I make, somebody who eats beef every single day of the year is probably doing better for animals than a vegetarian who slips up and has chicken once or twice. That's how bad eating chicken is. And just the short story of it is that chickens are so small. First of all, eating beef 300 times is one cow. And eating chicken one night is one or a half a chicken, right? So you've got that. And chickens are just raised in incredibly worse conditions.
Yes,
so
terrible.
What I do is I just don't worry about the beef I eat. And if I eat pork or chicken, I try to buy from places that have ethical standards. So I go to Whole Foods because Whole Foods has they just have ethical standards for their fish and for their whatever. And I don't feel bad buying meat of any kind there. So my wife likes bacon. We buy our bacon there. I buy my chicken there. But I also have calculated that if you give to the most effective animal welfare charity, which is the Humane League, if you donate $100 US dollars a year to them, you are offsetting The expected value is that you're offsetting a typical American diet, which causes the death of 300 animals. So if you donate $200 a year, and I donate at least $200 a year, you're actually doing twice as much good as being vegan, which is shocking to people, but that's basically what I do. And to me, okay, so this gets back to, I don't know who that person you're talking about. It's like, oh, you got to have the moral feeling behind what you're doing. I'm like, you know what? Somebody might be vegan because they really feel for animals and they have all these feelings or whatever. But I'm doing over twice as much good for animals, and the animals don't care what the feeling is in your heart. They don't want to suffer. Right. Like when the rubber hits the road, it's how much. What are you doing? What are you doing for animals? You know. And the thing is, if you are a typical American and you go vegan, you're sparing 300 animals from death. This is the animals you eat and all the bycatch, and the calculation is 300. You eat about 30 animals, incidentally, but you cause the death of 300. And so a vegan is saving, now that's if you're the average American. But the thing is, somebody who is vegan probably didn't eat a lot of meat anyway. Like if somebody who's vegan decided not to be vegan, they'd probably eat less than average. Let's say they'd cause the death of 150 animals a year. So really that person being vegan is saving 150 animals a year because the alternate is not as much as what the average American eats. So, you know, that's a really solid number there. And what you can do is by donating money to good charities, and what the Humane League does is that they tend to lobby businesses to have more humane practices. They've tried pamphleting, trying to get people to eat less meat. They found it's not quite as effective as trying to convince McDonald's, for example, to use eggs that are from chickens that aren't. So if they can do that, then we don't have to convince a whole lot of people to be constantly thinking about animal welfare. So yeah, that's why I'm not vegan. So I donate money, and that's how I help animals. And I truly believe I help animals more than vegans do, unless they're donating a lot.
I love that argument, and those calculations in your book are really quite enlightening. But that's the effect of altruism, right? Let's apply rationality to everything, including charity. So back to the Indugu effect, that's nice, but really, if you actually do the calculations, you can save a whole bunch of Indugus even if you don't know their name, and so you should override your moral intuitions in that sense.
Yes, that's right. That's right.
Yeah,
that's where the warm glow can lead you to less effective goodness.
Yeah, right. So, but if you read animal rights literature, they talk about like factory farming and how horrible it is. And it is, and if you watch those videos, which I have when I was writing that chapter in Moral Arc, I didn't eat meat for a couple of weeks, because it was just so awful. Mm-hmm. But then you kind of forget about it or whatever. So they're kind of after more of a, I don't know what you want to call it, kind of not necessarily a rights, but something like there's something inherent in the organism that they're conscious and they're aware and they suffer. And you only have to look at one of those hidden camera videos of these factory farms, and it's, oh my God, how could they not be suffering, right? So then you get the argument, well, let's have that kind of the happy cow farm where they get to roam around and they have their friends, and everything is close to what they would be like in nature until the time it comes to slaughter them.
Right, the one bad day.
The one bad day, yeah. So what does the research show about when their sentience? I mean, what lobsters, whatever. Does it have to be mammals? What about non-mammals, and so on?
Yeah, this is an area of intense disagreement. And so what I did was, in the first draft of my book, I read about this stuff and I said, okay, I think chickens are capable of this much suffering. And I think cows are capable of more, and pigs are in between. And I'm going to give these numbers, and I'm going to do a bunch of calculations. And then I got in touch with this economist who read my book. And he said, you're dealing with uncertainty completely incorrectly. And I said, what do you mean? He's like, when there is uncertainty in a field, you need to respect that uncertainty and treat it as a probability distribution. So the idea is that if 75% of, let's just say 75% of economists believe one thing and 25% believe another, and it's there's an economic idea, then the rational thing to do, respecting the uncertainty of the field, is to treat it as though it were 75% probable of being correct. So what we did was we looked at what a lot of scholars have said the sentience of these animals are. So there's some people who think that humans are the only ones who can feel pain and suffering. They're living philosophers and animal researchers who believe that. There's a very interesting article arguing that ray-finned fish are absolutely unconscious. It's a very interesting article, and it's not brain dead. And then there's some people who think that, all animals feel the same amount of suffering. So like even a mosquito getting swatted is feeling the same amount of pain as a human getting squashed by a piano or something. I don't know. And then there are a very, very small minority who think that simple animals feel more pain and suffering. And the idea here is that they have no cognitive or memory or rationalization or narrative to help make the suffering any better. So the suffering is like cosmic. There's no amelioration of it. And so what you do is we estimated what percentage of the experts believed these different things. And then we looked at the moral reasoning about it. Because once you figure out how much they're suffering, there's how much should we care? Because not everybody's utilitarian, right? Some people think that a unit of happiness, the same amount of happiness in a human, is more valuable than that amount of happiness in a dog or a pig or a chicken. I don't believe that, but there are some very smart people who believe it. So let's put those in. And what we did was we had all these moral theories. We had all the moral theories, we had all the sentience theories, and then we ran this 100,000 run Monte Carlo simulation to come up with what does the field think is moral. And doing all that, we came up with ranges and numbers of how sentient the main animals that we eat actually are. And there are ranges, and the ranges are huge, and you can put point values on these, like chickens, like 0.3, like 0.3 multiplier on any human suffering. But the ranges are so big and the uncertainty is so big that it's safer to actually give ranges.
But then if you just donate to charity and eat them anyway, that you've kind of overridden that moral aspect of it, that part of it. No?
You mean you've compensated for the bad that you're doing?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, sure. I mean, to me, I feel like it's a leftover from deontology, where it's an assuming deontology to talk about things being right and wrong anymore. Like, to me, I don't think of things as like right and wrong so much as there's how good is it and how bad is it, right? So yes, the fact that I sometimes go to Popeyes and have the fried chicken, I am hurting some chickens. I'm encouraging factory farming, and when I donate to the Humane League, I am sparing animals a life of suffering. And what I aim to do is, in the life that I have, to increase welfare as much as I can. But I'm under no illusions that there are many things that I do that make the world worse. Climate change is a perfect example of this, where there's almost nothing you can do that doesn't make the climate worse. I mean, like this, just recording this, let alone releasing it to the world, is making the climate worse. So, like, unless you're just like planting seeds in your garden and you didn't even drive to get the seeds, there are very few things you could do that don't make the climate worse. And now we have calculations about how many people are going to die in the next 100 years for every ton of carbon you put in the atmosphere. Even eating vegetarian food involves the death of rodents, and pesticides kill insects. The Jainists come as close as you can to eating without killing, but practically speaking, you cannot eat without killing. And it's just a matter of minimizing your damage. That's the way I look at it. So that's why I don't like to look at it in terms of black and white, and why veganism as this like sacred moral code to me is just another number of animals you're saving. And vegans end up killing animals because of the way that food's harvested.
Do you know the work of Bjorn Lomborg on climate change and
Did he
the
write
economics of it?
The Skeptical Environmentalist?
Yeah, that's correct. Yeah, and he's done a number of books since then. His thing is kind of an economic, like Nordhaus's economic calculations. So, okay, if we're going to spend $1 trillion in the next century to lower the temperature 2.5 degrees or 1 degree or whatever, what else might we have done with that $1 trillion that would have saved X number of people even more. Mosquito nets, vaccinations, potable water, and so on. It's not just a simple thing. Climate change is the worst thing ever, and it's the only problem worth bothering with. So we should do anything we can, regardless of the cost. And anyway, so that's his pushback against that. I think that's a purely utilitarian argument.
I hate to say I agree with Bjorn Longboard, but I might in this case. And so the effective altruism movement for your listeners is trying to maximize the good you do for your effort and your money and everything. And there are charity evaluators that rank and evaluate animal welfare, climate change, and human health. Those are the three big areas that they look at. And as to my knowledge, my book is the first to actually try to compare them to each other. The most effective climate change, the most effective animal welfare, and the most effective human health. And given a choice between those three, which one is best? And my calculations were that, with a lot of uncertainty, that human health was the best. So I actually do believe that, at least for an individual, fighting malaria is a better bet for increasing welfare over the next 100 years than fighting climate change is.
Let's touch on the value of a human life. I like that section in your book. I just watched it on Netflix the other night, that movie called Worth. And it's the story, Michael Keaton plays Ken Feinberg, who George W. Bush tapped to direct the 9/11 families, victims compensation. I forget the exact name of it was, but let me see if I can get the name here. The 9/11 Victim Fund. Congress allocated, I think it was $7 billion for the victims of. So these are all the different family members of everybody that died, the Pentagon, the two World Trade Centers, all the planes, and so forth. And it really shows how messy that is. Now, Feinberg is a law professor, and he worked in this area of, like, when somebody gets killed in a car accident and Ford or GM gets sued, they have to come up with a number. What does the car company owe the family of the victim who died? Well, how much did he make? How much would he have made if he worked for another 30 years, and on and on and on, right? So there are ways to put numbers on this, but this poor guy ran into these thousands of family members of 9/11 victims, and their sense, the average person's sense was, you will just take the $7 billion and divide it by the 6,500 people. Everybody gets the same. And it's like, well, no. The families of the guy that worked at the Goldman Sachs trading and he made $5 million a year on the 100th floor versus the cocktail waitress at the Windows of the World who made $35,000 a year, those are not the same, right? So,
wow.
Here again, I think you have this kind of deontological argument. All lives are equal versus the utility. In this case, I think it would be a utilitarian argument. Some lives are more valuable than others.
Yeah. So the utilitarians. So my interpretation of utilitarianism is that we're interested in welfare, and people are just containers of it. So it's not that one life is just as valuable as another life. It's that happiness in one life is just as valuable as happiness in another life. So when we're trying to save lives, for example, we would rather save the life of a 20-year-old person than a 70-year-old person, because we're actually saving more years of life, assuming they have the same happiness. They're more years of life. Women live longer than men, so it's actually more cost effective to save women of the same age than men, because they're going to live less time. And so, I like to think of it in terms of welfare, not money, right? Sometimes you need to translate it into money, but I feel like that is should be done when necessary. Unfortunately, a lot of the way economists approach these problems is in terms of money, and they have to put everything in terms of money. And then in those cases, I either ignore it or I try to translate it into welfare or years of human life saved or something like that. But yeah, so if you're looking at, so this is an interesting thing, I would think this is a slightly different problem than talking about the value of a human life, because what this means is they're looking at what was this person's value to the other people in their lives? So like somebody who made $1 million a year at Goldman Sachs or whatever, but has no dependents, maybe nobody should get a payout. I mean, like, it doesn't mean his life was worthless, but it wasn't worth anything to anybody else. you know?
Well, it's the problem, again, back to the law and what they have to do.
Yeah.
In the film, they showed how a lot of the long-term effects of the first responders, like a year later or 2 years later, were not in those calculations because they just had to draw the line. It happened on that day, 9/11, that's it. Anybody that died after is not part of our bin of money we're going to pay out.
Wow.
Well, that doesn't seem fair. Those guys are down there for months on end cleaning the thing up. They get sick and die. They should be compensated too.
Yeah. These things are they're always fraught.
Or if a family sues Ford Motor Company and they win a judgment in court, and then the jury has to come up with a number. What's the number? Right?
Yeah, and I would I would love it to be the case that it's always straightforward to come up with a number, but it isn't. And people will tend to, unfortunately, they will often tend to favor the calculations that would end up benefiting them and theirs.
Yes.
Which is against the spirit of the enterprise, in my opinion. But people are people.
Well, yeah, that's like the reparations thing. Well, okay, what's the number? That's hard to calculate, but that doesn't mean you can't calculate it, right? Don't let Don't let perfection be the enemy of the good,
right?
But if you open that door, what about the Native Americans? And if they owned, let's say, the Louisiana Purchase, which Jefferson bought from Napoleon, it wasn't Napoleon's to sell, and it wasn't Jefferson's to buy. I mean, what? What would that land be valued now in the 21st century? Trillions and trillions of dollars. At some point, it just seems just hopeless to come up with the number.
Yes, and this is a much bigger issue in Canada than in the U.S. I mean, it's the major diversity and equity question. The Indigenous people, and the term used here is reconciliation often. Problematic term, but it's the descendants of the colonizers don't agree, the indigenous people don't agree, and so it's just this very long negotiation trying to make things right, and we all got to live here. What can we do? And it's very, very hard. And I respect a lot the people who are wading through any of these issues we're talking about. You're bringing up lots of like issues where I don't have a either not a straight answer or an answer with very low certainty, because there are things that just need to be waded through and negotiated and thought about and analyzed. And I really respect the people who are kind of dedicating their lives to trying to make it work.
Well, yeah, there's sort of justice movement and truth and reconciliation committees. I mean, part of that is just psychological, just apologizing for the mistakes of the past, even if they happened generations ago and no one's even alive that had anything to do with it. That does seem to have some effect. Yeah,
didn't the Pope apologize recently for the?
He did, yes, about gays, and that it turns out God doesn't hate gays.
No, I wasn't thinking of that. I think it was something about the Indigenous people of Canada, actually. So I think he.
Oh, okay, yes, I think he did.
And there were people who were like, "Oh, what good's an apology?" And then some of the people like just cried with like release, like so. I think there's an effect of words. I want more than words, but words are not valueless.
That's right. Most people want more than words.
Have you ever heard Anthony Jeselnik's? You ever heard Anthony Jeselnik's joke about thoughts and prayers?
No.
It's like whenever someone posts on social media about my thoughts and prayers for the victims of blah blah blah, what they're really saying is, in this time of tragedy, don't forget about me.
That's really funny. I like that. Yeah, that reminds me of those land acknowledgement statements that universities have been issuing, and now corporations. We apologize to the native people who own the land that university is sitting on here. Oh yeah, you're going to give it back to them? Oh, well, no, we're not doing that.
Yeah, that's a interesting topic that I would love to see some research on. There might be research on it. I don't know what it is, but I feel that. So there's often an argument that trying to regulate how people talk, either with law or with cultural pressure, is lip service, and people there. I've read arguments like people don't use the N-word, but they still are racist. And so what good's it doing? But I bet that there's a very strong effect on the next generation that even like, having like land acknowledgements or more respectful ways of referring to minorities and whatever, the people who grow up in that environment might not be privy to the inner racist and sexist and horrific thoughts that people have if they are talking correctly. And so I suspect and hope that there is a good long-term effect to merely changing language, right? So like the land acknowledgements, yes, it's not giving the land back and it's not doing this, but maybe it is going to have effects on the cultural zeitgeist about these issues.
I think that's true, right? Absolutely. Expands the moral sphere of who you consider to be worthy of your group, right? And we would ideally like the entire human race to be in the same group.
Yes.
And so that does matter. Language matters for sure. I'm not crazy about language police running around trying to bust people online for things they said 20 years ago. But in principle, yes, Pinker and I and Dawkins, others have written about these kind of long-term trends. It's hard to pinpoint, but of course you have top-down laws, no more slavery. We're not going to do that. Or the ending of sati in India, the British colonial government just said, you're not doing that anymore. And if you do, we're going to arrest you and take your stuff and burn you. We're going to hang you. And that ended it. Okay. Well, for the most part, sometimes you have to do that. I don't think slavery would have ended in the United States without a civil war for at least probably another half a century, because it was economically reasonably viable and so forth. But but better is changing people's hearts and minds from the bottom up through TV scripts, comic books, films, novels, and so on. Dawkins makes this point in The God Delusion about he could tell down to about a decade when a novel was written based on the kind of language used to describe women and Jews and blacks and so on.
Interesting.
And, it's hard to pinpoint where it happened or how it happened. It just happened slowly, just slowly enough. You don't really see it until you look back like 50 years ago. Wow, look at the way they talked in that novel. It's like Huck Finn, you can't, read this out loud because he uses the N-word or whatever. And
it's really funny with science fiction. I was reading science fiction stories from the 60s, and it's like there's spaceships and there's all these technologies, but like the women are always serving coffee, and it's just like the men are the only ones who know how to do anything, and it's just like that's never going to change.
That's really funny. Yes. Not all this. Yeah, a lot of those first science fiction writers were white males.
No, but I hate to defend white males, but I think that there is a tendency of everybody to underestimate cultural change and overestimate technological change. So I bet even many science fiction novels being written now will be laughed at, no matter who's writing them, white men or anybody else, because it's hard to predict how the culture is going to change, and that's not what people go to science fiction for a lot of the times.
Yeah, well, Roddenberry was a humanist, atheist humanist, and populated his Bridge the Enterprise with a diverse group of people. That helps.
You're right. I think you're right. I think that's actually a really good counter example. Is he actually
there's a lot of
he did actually put social changes into his science fiction in a way that I think was pretty rare.
Definitely. And, a lot of black women said, I was inspired by Uhura. And she herself tells the story. I don't know how accurate that is, but she said she was thinking about quitting the show, wanted to do some other jobs and so on. And Star Trek wasn't that big in the first airings. And then Martin Luther King comes by the set or whatever it was. She meets him somewhere and he says, what you're doing is really important so that people can just see a black person in a position of power and authority on the bridge of a starship. Just doing that, if nothing else is. And I think that's right. I mean, Biden making a big point about appointing a black female Supreme Court justice.
Mhm.
You know, that sounds like, oh, come on, you're selecting people based on their skin color and gender and so on. Yeah, but it does have an effect,
Yeah.
you know, for young black females, girls growing up going, look, I could do that.
Yeah. Yeah. That's the a lot of the justification for, this kind of stuff it is inspiring to people.
Role models.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. All right, let's talk into calculations about children. Should you have children or not? I mean, I don't even want to think about the amount of money I've spent on my little 6-year-old son now, toys constantly and so on. If you just did the calculation, I shouldn't be buying him so many toys. I shouldn't even have a kid.
Do I say that?
No, you don't say that,
Oh.
but there are some effective altruists. Maybe that's not the right term for them, but these long-termists, doing those kinds of utilitarian calculations.
Yes. So let's deal with this in stages. So one way to look at it is that when you are having a kid, you are generating a carbon producer, and you're generating a self-replicating carbon producer, and somebody who, if they grow up in the rich part of the world, might continue to abuse animals by eating them. And if you look at the way I do, like a lot of people, like most of the people that I know, and maybe even myself, are making the world worse than they're making it better. Like, I think it's very possible that I am at this point, having a negative effect on the universe, which is pretty depressing, but I think it might be true for me and almost everyone I know. Then, is making a kid worth it. But another way to look at it is that you are creating another container of welfare. And this is where utilitarians sort of split. There's a difference between people, what I call total utilitarians and average utilitarians, and it depends on how you add up the welfare. So if more welfare is better is your view, then you're a total utilitarian, and that's what I endorse. And an average utilitarian looks at all of the beings that are capable of having welfare. What's the average, and should you raise the average? Both of these views lead to some very uncomfortable edge cases. But if you let's just assume total utilitarianism for a minute, where that means that if you cause the generation of a welfare-containing being like a kid, and that kid's life is worth living in the sense that their life is good enough that they should stay alive. Like, some people's lives are so bad. This is where like assisted suicide comes in. Their lives are so bad that they would be better off if they weren't alive, because they have negative utility overall. If that kid would have positive utility, even if it was small, and the effects that they have on the world don't counteract that, then yes, you should be having as many kids as possible, right? But the result of that, which some people call the repugnant conclusion, is that we could have a world absolutely teeming with people who are just barely happy enough to have lives worth living. And by the total utilitarian, we've done good, right? Rather than having a smaller population of very happy people. So it's a problematic issue. And I really don't believe that telling anybody having kids is good or bad makes a much difference in whether they have a kid or not. But, it is an interesting exercise.
Yeah, I don't know. It's just so fundamental to the human condition, like sex, that it doesn't really fit those kinds of calculations, it seems to me. I mean, and if anything, I have a moral obligation to take care of my children. And if I make some utilitarian calculus, well, I'll let my kids starve, and I'll spend the money on some effective altruist charity that'll save more people, I could be locked up by Child Protective Services, right?
Mm-hmm. That's right. That's right. Yeah. I in writing the book, I've come to accept that, like, one of the nice things about some people's simplistic deontologies, not that everyone has a simplistic deontology, but many do, is that they get the benefit of being very sure that on certain days they've been perfectly good people. And I can't have that anymore. And It's all gray areas and damage being
Mm-hmm.
done, unpredictable damage being done all over the place.
Mm-hmm. 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 And what is your opinion of long-termism, and how does that relate to effective altruism?
Yeah, long-termism is the branch of effective altruism that examines um, the long-range effects of welfare in the entire universe. So things like thousands of years from now, possible space colonization, existential threats, those kind of things. And uh, it's not something I dealt with a lot in the book. The problem is that there's often so much uncertainty about the long term future that it makes certain kind of conclusions hard to swallow. So there's an issue in statistics that very things with very small probabilities that have very big consequences. You can argue that they should like eat all the money or eat all the resources. So like if we're looking at a human extinction, if that even has a modest probability of happening, there's an argument to be made that we should be putting all of our resources into it to the I mean, like, and if people have to die and disease rampages and war, like it doesn't, none of that matters because extinction is so bad that we should be doing everything, and that's very hard for people to accept, and the numbers are very uncertain. So and because I don't think it had been explored, I think Will McCaskill does a really good job exploring it in his recent book, which came out after mine. So I didn't give it a whole lot of so my book's much more about more concrete helping people over the next 100 years, which is not long term by the long termist standards.
I know, but see, this is what I didn't like about the long-termism. It seems so science fiction-y and far off, and the error bars are just massively wide. How do you know this is going to happen? You don't know, right? I mean, even the best super forecasters, more than 5 years out, are no better than chance at predicting what's going to happen. So to talk about 500 years from now or 500,000 years from now, this is how many people will have been born, and this is what we should do for them now. Forget the future generations, at least those. I mean, maybe I should be concerned about my children's children's children, maybe half a dozen generations out, something like that. We want to leave them a habitable planet. But, but it's more important that we take care of the people that are living now, right? I mean, if I can spend money on mosquito nets to save 100 lives in Africa because of malaria right now, this year, I don't care what the consequences I could have done with the money if I invested it in, let's just randomly say cryptocurrency and made myself a billionaire. And then I get to save 500 million lives, 500,000 years from now. Come on. That's a bunch of bullshit. It seems to me.
Yeah. I mean, I don't think that, I'm glad some people are working on it. I don't think it should be ignored, but I also think that if you're doing any kind of effective altruism, you're doing so much better than almost everyone else on earth that I applaud it. Arguing about whether long-termism is more important than helping people in the short term, and even like my calculation that human health is a better bet for being good than climate change or animal welfare. These all have big error bars too. Right? If insects can feel the same amount of suffering as people, we are really screwed. Like,
right.
Like we cannot. I don't see how we could possibly be good people if insects dying from a pesticide, for example, suffer as much as like a person being gassed. Like, if that's true, then we are. I don't know how we could possibly be good. Right?
Well, I guess a solution technological would be genetic engineering. Just breed these mosquitoes that can't continue breeding. They're just sterile or whatever, and then they're just gone. Of course, that would be extinction.
Make mosquitoes extinct, you mean?
Yeah, good riddance.
Yeah, if you're not a bat, I suppose.
Oh, well, that's true. Bats, that's true. They're food for bats. Okay, I forgot about the bats.
Well, any animal is part of an ecosystem. I mean, like, and the smaller it is, the bigger a deal it is. I mean, I don't like mosquitoes either, and I said to biologists, we have wasps in late August here, and they drive me crazy. And I just said to my biologist friend, I was like, oh, God, I wish wasps would go extinct. And he reminded me that no, wasps actually are the vultures of the insect world. And they clean up all the dead bodies of all the insects. And what would we do without the wasps? I'm like, okay, biologist.
Interesting. I did not know that.
It's always a complex web.
Well, yeah, that's never changed. And we can't go back. Right. So there are these people, anti-natalists, is that the term? Right. They just think, there's just too many people, get rid of the people. And that,
I don't know what that. Yeah, I've
people
heard
that are
of voluntary extinction. I've heard that expression. Yeah. I've never heard antinatalist, but yeah, I know there are people who think that humans should voluntarily go extinct.
Yeah, well, you first, I say to them. I'll see you to the door. All right, let's
wrap it up.
Let's wrap up talking. Just a few things back to self, right? What do you recommend people to do to have a fulfilled, happy, purposeful life?
Happiness. Probably the reason a lot of people started listening until we got off on ethics for an hour and a half.
That's okay, because these are hugely important and interesting topics. But just kind of hit the highlights, like physically, financially, marriage, friends, family. What am I gonna? Yeah. Do I need religion?
So luckily, the key, the secret to happiness is having a rich social life. That is. A refreshingly simple answer that many other parts of the book can't offer. But Susan Pinker makes a great case for it in The Village Effect, where having a rich social life actually extends your longevity more than quitting smoking and exercise and all these other things. Being around people that you care about and enjoy the company of is the single best thing you can do for your longevity and your happiness. So that's a real simple one. Then there's stuff like exercise and eating right and this kind of thing. But the big take home is social.
How many friends? What's the number? And there's casual friends, there's close, good friends. I only have a couple. Marriage or a serious loving partner. There's different kinds of social.
Married people tend to be a little happier, and religious people tend to be a little happier, but that tends to be just the people who attend religious social gatherings. So it could be that the benefit that religion appears to get, if you look at the raw numbers, is actually encouraging social cohesion. And I've been unable to find a community that gives the benefit of what some of my church-going friends experience. And in our society, I find it actually quite difficult to get the level of sociality that I think is optimal for human happiness in our culture.
Without religion, you mean?
But even with religion, I think it's hard. I mean, like a lot of people think it's weird if you invite them over to dinner every week. But if you're not talking to somebody every week, is it really an intimate relationship?
Right.
I think that there are cultures in the world where there's a much more intense communication and everyone knows the day to day, and it's not just catching up. I feel like when I get together with my friends, it's always catching up, and that's not the kind of intimacy that I think is really important for it. So, religion and workplace friends are great for that, especially if you're not at a high power workplace where you actually can go chat with your colleague at their cubicle. You could actually talk to somebody every day, and maybe some of your closest friends or your coworkers that you get to talk to a lot and have lunch with or whatever. Marriage is good for health, and it's also good for happiness. But that's if it's a good marriage, and and similarly with children, children seem to be pretty good for your happiness if you actually want them. But the average is brought down so much by the people who didn't want kids but did anyway that on average having kids seems to have little or negative effect on happiness. So
again, I've heard this a lot, including from Dan Gilbert. And to which I say, if that's why you're having kids for the wrong reason. You don't have kids so you can just walk around with a beatific smile on your face. That's not the reason for it. It's because it makes your life much richer on all levels, more meaningful, purposeful. Just everything.
Well, that seems to be suggesting that the meaning does not bottom out into happiness, which not everybody agrees with. So Are you happier because your life's more meaningful? Because if you are, then you maybe could say, "No, it actually does make me happier," because it goes through instrumentalism to make that happen.
Right. Well, so then we're back to the operational definition of happiness. What do you mean by that? So at some level, you have to, when you ping people on their app and ask them how they're feeling right now on a scale of 1 to 10, you assume they're talking about the same thing in their head that you think that they're feeling, right? Yes, I'm happy or I'm fulfilled. Well, it's not always happiness is the word, right? It's
life satisfaction.
Life satisfaction, right? Yeah.
Right. So the two main ways to measure happiness are sort of like the hedonic pleasure moment to moment, and then the life satisfaction, which is more of a reflective, how's my life going? And then some people argue for what you're saying. I think Pinker does in one of his books, that there's this meaningfulness that's kind of a third category. And I think that's something that's good for the happiness psychologist to hash out. I don't have a strong opinion on it yet. For me, it's like, I look at, I'm more of like a hedonic utilitarian, which is just the raw pleasure, even if you don't remember it, less on life satisfaction, more on just how much happiness was there. But, I think this is a great area of research.
Roy Baumeister has a nice paper on this, that happiness is more short-term, meaningfulness is more long-term. Meaningfulness is like looking long forward, backward, and backwards in your life. What have I done? What has it meant? What am I going to do going forward the next couple of years, decades, whatever? Whereas happiness is more like, I'm going out with my friends for dinner tonight. That's going to be great fun. And both of those are good, right? But maybe it's just we're not finding the right word, or the words have slightly different meanings. Like examples I've used is, caretaking for 2 of my 4 parents. I had step parents. And, it wasn't fun driving my dad to all these doctors and just, schlepping him around. And, it was just, but I did it because it's like, that's what you do. You just do that. It's a good thing to do. I'm a better person for doing it. But I wasn't happy doing it. I wasn't like, oh, this is so much fun. This is almost as good as going out for drinks with my buddies, right? It wasn't in that category at all.
Well, I mean, I think the way to think about it is, how would you feel if you just didn't do that and let him suffer and whatever?
Exactly.
I would feel terrible. So that might
right.
bottom out in happiness.
Yep. Okay. All right. That sounds good. All right, Jim. Here we go. Being the person your dog thinks you are. Is that your dog, by the way?
No, that's a stock photo.
Stock photo. I just wondered that because it's a handsome dog.
Yeah.
All right. Well, we'll have you back on with the consciousness book, which I agree. I think that's one of the most important topics that there is. So I'm looking forward to reading that.
Love to be back. Thanks, Michael.